They say greatness begins in silence, but that night there was no silence. Only the low cry of a laboring woman in a marble-walled chamber just off the Via Aurelia, where the candles flickered like nervous sentries and the perfume of crushed laurel leaves hung thick in the air. Outside, the Tiber murmured beneath a half-moon, and Rome itself, gritty, proud, eternal, hummed in its sleep. Aurelia Cotta gripped the wooden rail of the birthing couch, her breath sharp and deliberate, her face gleaming with the effort of bringing a new soul into the world. She was no fragile flower, this woman. She was Roman nobility, daughter of a consul, wife of a praetor, and a Cotta by blood. Her strength was carved in marble, and her eyes burned with the cold clarity of a woman who knew power by instinct. The midwife whispered encouragement in hushed Latin, the kind passed down through generations of women who understood that birth and death were sisters. And from the shadows, a young servant girl, no older than 13, knelt with a bowl of warm water, her dark eyes wide and reverent. The pain came like a tide, fierce and rhythmic, ancient as Rome itself. Aurelia bore it in silence now, teeth clenched, eyes fixed on the ceiling where the oil lamp shadows danced like spirits. She had seen war wounds before, on her husband's back, on her father's arms. But this was different. This was a battlefield only women knew. And then, just as the stars seemed to blink, the child arrived. A boy. The air held still, trembling in that breathless space between the end of agony and the beginning of fate. The infant cried, loud, insistent, proud. The midwife smiled, the servant girl gasped, and Aurelia, she only closed her eyes and nodded, as if she had known all along. Gaius Julius Caesar, she whispered, voice low and steady. She did not look to her husband, Gaius Julius Caesar the elder, who stood at a careful distance, observing, his features sculpted in that Roman way, dignity always first. He said nothing, though his jaw tightened as the boy was wrapped and placed into Aurelia's arms. The name was not chosen lightly. Julius, from the genes Julia, a lineage as old as legend, and Caesar, a name wrapped in mystery. Some say it meant hairy. Others claimed it marked an ancestor who was born by cesarean. But Aurelia believed it meant something more, cut from the womb by the gods themselves. The boy blinked at her, squirming like a fish just pulled from sacred waters. His skin was flushed, his lips pursed in a warrior's scowl. And even then, yes, even then, there was something about him, a stillness, a gravity, as if he had arrived already aware of the stage on which he had been summoned. That night, while Rome slept and the winds from the 7 hills blew cool over the tiled rooftops, Aurelia held her son and whispered into his tiny ear, "You will not be safe in this world, but you will be great." The next morning, the household bustled with ritual. Incense was lit for Juno Lucina, the goddess of childbirth. Offerings were laid in the household shrine. Slaves moved quietly, efficiently, whispering of omens. How the owl had not hooted, how the household dog had not barked. These were good signs, auspicious. And in the street below, neighbors murmured as word of the birth spread through the patrician quarter. Another Caesar born, another Julian, but no one paid it much mind. After all, patrician boys were born every week in Rome. But fate has a taste for irony. It often begins in the background, with whispers instead of trumpets. In the following days, Aurelia watched her child like a priestess guards her flame. She nursed him herself, a rare thing among the noble women of Rome. But Aurelia had no patience for wet nurses. She wanted her son to feed from her own body, to carry her strength in his bones. Each time he suckled, she whispered words of the old histories, the stories of Romulus, of Camillus, of Scipio Africanus. She did not cradle him like something delicate. She held him like a soldier might hold a standard, firm, reverent, unbreakable. Her husband, meanwhile, busied himself with politics. The elder Gaius was a respected man, measured, cautious, always with an eye on the Senate. He had no illusions of greatness for his son. Respectable, yes, perhaps a governor one day, but not more, not more. Aurelia never told him what she had seen in the child's eyes. Years passed, and the boy began to grow. Rome changed with each season. The streets pulsed with life, civic feasts, tribunal elections, market gossip, and rising tension between populares and optimates. The city was alive with ambition and death. The child watched. From the villa balcony, young Caesar saw senators wrapped in purple togas, slaves hurrying with amphorae, priests sweeping ash from temple altars. He saw how men kissed each other's cheeks and stabbed each other's backs. He saw how the forum roared with promises and lies, and always Aurelia stood beside him, whispering lessons the tutors would never teach. "Power doesn't shout," she told him once. "It listens, it waits, and when it moves like thunder wrapped in silk." He remembered that. In time, Aurelia would watch her son walk into the world alone. He would wear the toga virilis. He would give speeches in the forum. He would march, bleed, seduce, command, conquer. And one day, his name would cross the lips of emperors, poets, and kings. But that was all in the future. For now, he was still her boy. Small, solemn, burning quietly in the cradle, like a coal waiting for the wind. And on quiet nights, when the house was still and the olive trees rustled gently in the garden, Aurelia would rise from her couch, cross the mosaic floor, and kneel beside his bed. She would place her hand on his chest and feel the tiny heartbeat beneath. And she would whisper, "Remember who you are, Gaius. Remember what sleeps in your blood." Rome was a city of marble and filth, of triumph and rot, of glory that gleamed high above and secrets that festered far below. And it was in this city, in the crooked alleys of the Subura district, where perfume sellers shouted beside butchers and wine-soaked arguments spilled into the gutters, that a patrician child named Gaius Julius Caesar first learned how to listen, not just to words, but to silence, to rhythm, to power. Livia, once a scribe in Athens, now a slave in the Julian household, had been tasked with teaching the boy his letters, Greek and Latin, verse and prose, memory and melody. But she quickly learned he already knew them. He absorbed knowledge like he breathed in the dust of Rome, without effort, without pause. But what he loved most was stories. "Tell me about Alexander," he asked, again and again. And Livia would smile, push the wax tablet aside, and begin. She told him of Alexander the Great, son of Philip, boy king of Macedon, who cut the Gordian knot and burned through Asia like a storm. She told him how Alexander had wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. And little Caesar, barefoot, knees scraped from climbing olive trees in the courtyard, listened with a hunger far beyond his years. "He was my age when he led his first men into battle," Caesar said once, eyes narrowing. "You are 10, Livia replied, "and this is Rome, not Macedon." But he only smiled, that small, knowing smile he would carry his whole life, the smile of someone already speaking with history. Though he was born into a noble clan, Caesar's childhood was not cloistered behind villa walls. His family was ancient, yes, but not wealthy. They had name, but not coin. And so, while other patrician boys lounged in garden courtyards, young Caesar walked the Subura, and the Subura was alive, There were bathhouses choked with steam and curses, vendors selling honey-drenched nuts beside blood-soaked sandals, actors in masks declaiming Plautus to half-drunken crowds, and women, sharp-eyed, silver-tongued, who could read a boy's ambition like a scroll. From the fruit seller he learned bargaining. From the gamblers, risk. From the street orators, rhythm. But from the shadows he learned something deeper. He learned what fear looked like in a soldier's jaw. He saw how slaves moved when they were owned by cruel men. He saw how poor mothers lied with their eyes, smiling as they rationed bread. And slowly, wordlessly, the city became his first battlefield. Aurelia allowed these wanderings, though her husband disapproved. She believed in knowledge earned with dirty hands, and she trusted Livia to walk at his side. "Watch him," she'd say, "but don't guide him. He needs to see the world before it sees him." And so Livia watched. She watched him kneel beside a crippled beggar, not out of pity, but with interest. She watched him climb onto a broken wall to recite lines of Homer, as if commanding a legion. She watched him sit silently in a tavern corner, listening to veterans speak of Marius and Sulla, of civil war and butchered dreams. And when they returned to the household, and the lamps were lit and the oil burned low, he would ask her one last question before sleep. "Do you think a man can change Rome?" And she, who had once copied Aristotle's words in a quiet Athenian library, would answer with care, "Rome is not a man, Gaius. It is a beast. You don't change it. You tame it, or you let it devour you." He said nothing, but his eyes stayed open long after sleep should have come. As years passed, the streets grew more violent. Whispers of Sulla's rise drifted through the Subura like smoke. Caesar's uncle, Gaius Marius, once Rome's greatest general, now lived in disgrace. His statues toppled, his name spat upon. Still, Caesar walked the city. Once, he saw a man whipped in the Forum for insulting the Senate. Another time, he heard a woman scream as her son was taken for debt. And always, he listened. He asked questions. He remembered names. Then came the games. He was 11 when his father first took him to the Circus Maximus. The roar of 80,000 throats, the colors of the charioteers, red, blue, green, white, blazing like fire on sand. He sat beside his father, proper and poised, but his heart galloped faster than any horse. When a man fell, dragged by tangled reins, crushed under hooves, Caesar didn't flinch. "Why do they cheer for blood?" he asked. "Because they fear it," his father answered, "better on the sand than in their homes." The boy never forgot that. That same year his father died suddenly. Some said fever, others suspected poison. Rome was a city where both came cheaply. Caesar stood at the pyre, dressed in mourning white, his face dry and unreadable. Aurelia wept quietly. The flames rose behind them, crackling like some ancient oracle. Livia stood a distance away beside the other household servants, watching the boy. Even then, he stood like a man, not tall, not broad, but still, like a blade before the draw. In the months that followed, he grew harder, sharper. He studied longer, spoke less. He still walked the Subura, but now with a small escort, 2 loyal freedmen and a silent Greek bodyguard. But Livia knew he didn't need protection. He was already beginning to understand something most men never did, that power wasn't just taken, it was studied, seduced, stalked like prey. And one night, when Rome was quiet and the stars hung low over the Palatine Hill, Caesar sat in the atrium beside Livia, fingers trailing through the water of the fountain. "Will you return to Greece someday?" he asked. She looked at him, startled. No child had ever asked her that. "Why do you care?" He shrugged. "You have good stories. I might need them later." She smiled, something like sorrow in her breath. "Then I'll stay, Gaius, until the stories run out." They would not, for the boy in the Subura was already becoming a name the world would remember, and the city, in its eternal, merciless way, was watching, listening, waiting. They had once called him the third founder of Rome, not Romulus, not Camillus, but Gaius Marius, the man who reshaped the legions and brought 7 consulates crashing through the gates of tradition. I had marched behind him once, beneath African suns, our shields blistered from heat and pride. But when he died, there were no legions waiting, no triumphs, just rain on the rooftops and silence in the streets. I was an old man by then, my knees stiff, my sword long since hung above the hearth. I'd returned to Rome, like many did, with a pension barely worth the name and memories sharper than any coin. I lived in a crooked room near the Janiculum Hill, and on the day Marius died, I heard the news from a wine seller's boy before I heard it from the Senate. That was how low he had fallen. They said he died raving, fevered, haunted by phantoms. But I remember him clear. I remember the way he rode, back straight, chin high, eyes like an eagle who had forgotten how to blink. The people had once cheered him so loudly, the forum trembled. But on that day, no bells rang for Gaius Marius. He died in a house on the Caelian Hill, a prisoner of age and madness, while the city turned its back. And yet, there were whispers. In the taverns, in the bathhouses, in the Subura, where plebeians clung to their faith like oil to cloth. They remembered. The veterans remembered. The ones who owed their farms and freedoms to his reforms. The ones who had been landless until Marius defied the Senate and made soldiers of the poor. They drank to his name in quiet corners, murmured stories of Germanic victories, of blood in the snow, of a general who had looked the gods in the eye and refused to kneel. But the patricians were done with him. He had returned to Rome one last time with blood in his heart and vengeance in his breath. He had marched on the city again. And though he had seized power, it was not with glory. It was with grim efficiency. Enemies executed, property seized. The old lion had teeth, and he used them. Too many teeth, the Senate would later say. Too much blood. The boy, Caesar, watched it all. He was 14 that year, still a quiet shadow of himself. I saw him once in the forum, standing beside his mother in mourning robes. His father was barely cold in the ground. And now his great-uncle, the man who had defined a generation, was gone too. He did not cry. He did not smile. He simply watched the men speaking Marius's name with caution, some with contempt, and a few with veiled reverence. That kind of watching stays in a man's eyes. I saw it then, the way he studied power not as myth, but as machine. After Marius's death, Sulla rose, and with him the darkness. Prescriptions, executions, lists posted in the forum naming men marked for death, heads mounted on spears outside the Senate. Rome became a butcher's floor disguised in marble. Caesar was too young to stop it, but old enough to be marked by it. Sulla wanted control, and anyone tied to Marius was dangerous. That meant Caesar, even as a boy, was a threat. And so Sulla summoned him, demanded he divorce Cornelia, daughter of Cinna, a Marius loyalist. Caesar refused. They say it nearly cost him his life. He vanished for a time after that, slipped from Rome with little more than a cloak and his name, into the hills, into the provinces, where Sulla's reach was longer than most believed, but not long enough. He survived, not by chance, by instinct. The city forgot Marius soon after. His statues had already been torn down, his laws undone, his memory turned to ash in the mouths of senators who once groveled for his favor. But we, the old soldiers, we remembered. We always remembered. And the boy remembered too, not just the man. but the fall. The silence that comes when power is spent and Rome decides she no longer needs you. I often wondered, years later, when Caesar stood in the Forum, when he crossed the Rubicon, when he wore the laurel crown, was it Marius he carried in his bones? Not just his blood, but his warning. History has little mercy, but memory in the hearts of those who survived the worst of it lingers like a wound. The death of Marius was the end of one Rome and the slow, quiet beginning of another. And that boy, Gaius Julius Caesar, was already listening to the whispers it left behind. The boy became a man in silence, not in battle, not in the Forum, but in exile, with the cold wind on his face and a sword strapped too loosely at his side. We left Rome by moonlight, under Sulla's shadow, with little more than a mule and a name. Gaius Julius Caesar, barely 16, already marked for death. He could have lived. All he had to do was yield. Sulla had summoned him. The dictator, fresh from conquest, drunk with power, ordered Caesar to divorce his wife, Cornelia, daughter of Cinna. It was politics, nothing more. A cutting of ties, a gesture of submission. But Caesar refused. No public outcry, no threats. Just a quiet, steady refusal that said more than 1,000 speeches ever could. Aurelia tried to reason with him. Even the priests begged him to comply. But he would not break a vow, not to the gods, and not to the girl he had chosen. He married for alliance, yes, but something deeper had grown in him. And I, a former tutor turned attendant, watched as Rome turned against him. Sulla stripped him of his inheritance, stripped him of his title as Flamen Dialis, priest of Jupiter. That alone should have broken him. No soldier, once a sacred priest, was meant to take up arms. He would be bound forever to the altar, locked away from the life he craved. But with Sulla's hand, even that burden fell away. And Caesar, suddenly free, chose flight over submission. We slept in stables, ate crusts with peasants, took shelter in shepherds' huts in the Sabine hills while winter crept down from the north. Caesar never complained. He watched the frost settle on the grass each morning as if reading omens in ice. His cloak was thin, his boots worn, but his resolve never cracked. He grew lean, scarred, quiet. Once Sulla's men nearly caught us near Nola. I remember the pounding of hooves, the flash of red cloaks in the trees. Caesar led us through a ravine, then up a sheer cliff path where no sane horse would follow. We slipped. I bled. He pulled me up with a hand that trembled but never let go. They say Sulla relented in the end, not out of mercy, but because too many voices in Rome pleaded for the boy's life. Too many senators whispered of his potential. Too many old friends of Marius saw in him a flicker of the past. Sulla, tired and dying, finally agreed to let him live. Let him live, he said. But one day, this Caesar will be the ruin of the aristocracy. There are many Mariuses in him. That was a prophecy, spoken by a man who had seen the Republic at its ugliest. A warning no one truly heeded. When Caesar returned, he was changed, his shoulders straighter, his eyes deeper, his voice no longer that of a boy born to privilege. He spoke with the quiet rhythm of someone who had learned to survive without applause. Rome barely noticed his return. He re-entered the city without parade or welcome, but I noticed. His blade was sharper now, both in mind and in spirit. He studied rhetoric under Milan of Rhodes, practiced law before hostile tribunals. When he spoke in court, the galleries filled, women leaned forward, senators narrowed their eyes. There was something magnetic about him even then, not just charm, something darker, a sense of fate unfolding word by word. But he did not abandon the blade. He joined campaigns in Asia, fought at Mytilene, won the civic crown, a wreath of oak leaves awarded only to those who saved the lives of Roman citizens. It was placed upon his head by a commander whose praise came rarely and reluctantly. Caesar said nothing of it. He wore the laurel for one day, then packed it away like a secret. The reward wasn't the honor. It was the knowing that when the time came, he could lead men into fire and they would follow. We stood together once at the edge of the sea near Pergamon. He looked out at the horizon, the salt wind tossing his cloak behind him like a banner. "Rome is a blade," he said, "always in someone's hand. The only choice is whether you sharpen it or let it cut you." He turned then, and I knew he would never let anyone else hold the hilt again. He came aboard like any other prisoner, hands bound, sandals worn thin, cloak stained from the dust of the Ionian roads. But even then, something about him made the men uneasy. The captain laughed when he named his ransom. 20 talents of silver, Caesar said, standing there like he was asking for wine. "Surely I'm worth at least that." The pirates roared, thinking it a joke. Arrogant Roman noble. They settled on 50 instead. He did not flinch. We were Cilicians, corsairs of the southern coast, wolves of the sea. We had raided merchant vessels and snatched senators before, but this boy was different. He did not beg. He did not bargain. He sent his freedmen to gather the ransom, then made himself comfortable. For 38 days, Gaius Julius Caesar lived among us, not as a prisoner, but as a guest who refused to leave. He scolded the captain for poor grammar, wrote poetry in the sun, demanded silence when he read aloud, and when someone laughed, he promised to have them crucified. We laughed harder then, but after a while, the laughter changed. He began to feel less like cargo and more like command. He joined our meals, gambled with the men, slept lightly and rose early. He joked with the oarsmen, but always with a strange certainty. Like a man rehearsing lines he would one day deliver to senators and kings. One afternoon, he stood at the bow, gazing out over the sea. I asked him what he would do when he was free. He didn't smile. "I'll return," he said. "I'll raise a fleet. I'll hunt every one of you down and have you nailed to a cross." I stared at him, half afraid, half amused. He spoke as though the gods were already listening. When the silver came, he left. No bitterness, no parting words. Just a nod to the captain and one final glance toward the ship's mast, as if picturing it draped in Roman red. We forgot about him after that, moved on to another island, another victim, but he had not forgotten us. Weeks later, sails appeared on the horizon, Roman sails. He had done exactly what he promised, raised ships, mustered men, secured the backing of local authorities. He tracked us to our cove like a hawk follows a mouse. There was no mercy. We surrendered. We begged. He retrieved the silver. Then, one by one, he crucified the crew. He showed a measure of kindness, if you can call it that. He ordered the executions be done swiftly, throats slit before the nails were driven, a soldier's death before a thief's punishment. It was more than we deserved. I was spared, by chance or fate, and told the story in whispers for years. Some thought it myth, a Roman boy alone against the sea. But I had seen his eyes, calm, cold, certain. He was no longer just a young patrician with ambition. He had become something else, a man who did not forget, a man who saw insult as prophecy. The sea had tested him, and he had risen, not as a victim, but as an executioner in waiting. Years later, when his name was shouted in the streets of Rome, when statues were raised and coins struck in his likeness, I remembered that voyage. I remembered the boy who laughed at pirates. And I knew then what we all should have known. He was never the prisoner. We were. The first time I heard his voice, I was copying court records on the edge of the forum, my ink drying faster than the judge's patience. He wasn't yet famous. just another patrician in white, young, polished, with that calm, calculating confidence that clung to certain men like perfume. But when he began to speak, the pigeons on the columns stilled, and even the marble seemed to lean in. He was prosecuting a corrupt governor, Dolabella, I think, an old friend of Sulla's. No one expected it to go anywhere. The court was crowded with senators and bored advocates, and the jury was fat with favors. But Caesar walked in like he owned the marble beneath his feet. He was elegant, yes, and deliberate, but not soft. There was a blade hidden under that laurel sweet voice, and when he spoke, it cut. He did not shout. That was what caught them first. While others thundered, he spoke like a man whispering secrets to the gods. His Latin rolled smooth and slow, sharpened by years of study in Rhodes and Athens. But it was the content, the steel under the silk, that stirred the room. He didn't just accuse. He exposed the bribes, the stolen taxes, the abuse of power. And he did it not as a warrior of justice, but as a master of performance. He gave the crowd not law, but theater. The jury, of course, voted as they were paid to. Dolabella walked free. But that wasn't the point. The real victory was outside, in the streets, in the shadows. People began to murmur the name Caesar again, and this time not as a relic of Marius or the scorn of Sulla. This time it was his own. He spoke often after that, in courts, at funerals, at public games, always measured, always dangerous. The old aristocrats sneered, but the people, oh, they listened, because he did what few dared. He mocked the Senate without shouting. He flattered the mob without begging. He promised change without making it sound like rebellion. He wore his ambition like a fine cloak, obvious but never gaudy. And he spent money, lavishly, games, feasts, public fountains. They whispered that he borrowed more than he owned, that he was drowning in debt just to stay afloat in the race for power. But to the people, he looked like Rome's golden sun. Generous, smiling, unstoppable. To his creditors, he was a bet on destiny. He made allies too, carefully. Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Pompey, the darling of the legions. He did not challenge them. He charmed them, wrapped them in promises, watched, waited, because Caesar knew the art of timing. He didn't want control yet. He wanted presence, influence, echo. I saw him once after a speech in the shadow of the temple of Castor and Pollux. He stood beneath the twin columns, alone, staring at the Senate steps. His cloak was soaked from rain, his hair matted to his forehead, but he stood still, like a man measuring the weight of history. And in that moment, I understood. He didn't just want to speak in the forum. He wanted to own it. He arrived in Spain like a man chasing shadows, too ambitious for the courts, too clever for the Senate, and too restless to wait. The title was governor, yes, but everyone knew what it meant. A chance to make money, a chance to win glory, a chance to prove that he could lead more than just words. I was a centurion in the 10th Legion then, stationed in Hispania Ulterior, where the hills rolled dry and red, and the tribes still remembered how to resist. We had seen governors come and go. Most were lazy, some cruel. A few made a show of order and left with heavy purses. But this one, Caesar, he moved like time was running out. He didn't pace. He hunted. He spoke to us like equals, not with softness, but with precision. He knew how to use charm like a sword, cutting, efficient, always aimed. He learned names, walked the camps at night, spoke of Rome and honor and spoils with a gleam in his eye that made even the tired veterans lean forward. And when the campaign began, he led from the front. We marched against the Lusitanians, who'd built their fortresses into the stone itself. We climbed cliffs before dawn, waded through thorn-choked rivers, laid siege with smoke and fury. I saw him once, sword drawn, cloak torn, blood on his cheek, not watching, but charging. He did not command from a horse. He fought like he was proving something to the gods. But it wasn't just war he won. It was the province. The tax rolls filled, roads were repaired, trade flowed. He settled disputes in market towns with words as sharp as spears, and yet the debts in Rome still hung around his neck like iron. He was governor, yes, but he was still Caesar, always looking forward, always reaching beyond. One night we camped near Gades, beside the temple of Hercules. He stood before the altar a long time, staring at the statue, silent. I asked him what troubled him. He looked at me, not with pride, but with something deeper. Alexander was my age when he had conquered the world, he said, and I've done nothing. Then he turned and walked into the night, as if ashamed of his victories. When the campaign ended, he had riches, soldiers, and respect, but he didn't linger. He returned to Rome like a storm about to break. The Senate didn't yet understand what he'd become in Spain. They saw only the title, not the transformation. But we knew, the men who marched beside him, who watched him balance ambition with iron, generosity with ruthlessness. We knew. He was no longer the clever orator or the fashionable aristocrat. He had tasted command. He had tasted what it meant to be obeyed without question, and Rome would never be the same again. The day he became Pontifex Maximus, the skies over Rome were silver with mist, and the Tiber moved like a serpent through fog. I remember it well because I stood on the steps of the House of the Vestals, holding an oil lamp and watching the nobles arrive in their white togas, their faces drawn and suspicious. He was not the obvious choice. He was young. He had enemies. And he had dared to campaign for a position that was meant for elder statesmen, men with temples in their eyes and dust in their veins. But Gaius Julius Caesar did not wait for permission. He simply stepped forward. The priesthood of Pontifex Maximus was no ceremonial crown. It was power. It held the keys to Rome's rituals, its calendar, its moral authority. The pontifex determined when wars could be waged, when marriages could be blessed, when omens would bind the Senate's will. It was not taken lightly. And yet, when the votes were cast, he won, over more experienced men, over tradition, over fear. Some whispered bribes, others muttered threats. But we in the sacred house knew better. He had not bribed their wallets. He had seduced their futures. He moved into the Domus Publica, the official residence of the chief priest, a marble-walled sanctuary just beside our sacred grove. He was respectful, always. He greeted the Vestals by name, spoke to us not as symbols but as women who carried the flame of the city in our hands. When the younger girls giggled behind their veils, I warned them to be cautious. Men like that are made of fire, I said. Beautiful to watch, dangerous to touch. But he never broke the sanctity of the office, not once. He oversaw rituals with grave attention, presided over festivals with effortless charm. He met with haruspices and augurs, listened to omens, and offered sacrifice with hands that never trembled. And yet, there was always something in his eyes. Not boredom, not mockery, a distance, as if he saw even the gods as part of the stage he was building. When Catiline's conspiracy unraveled that same year and the Senate fell into whispers and fear, he spoke cautiously. He defended the rights of Roman citizens to a trial. He opposed execution without due process, even as others, Cicero chief among them, demanded blood. Some said Caesar was protecting traitors, but I think he was already thinking ahead, not just about Catiline, but about precedent, about law, about what kind of world he might one day need to rule. He lived simply in the Domus Publica, but he hosted guests from all corners of Rome, plebeians, equestrians, nobles, radicals. He listened more than he spoke. That was the secret. He listened to the pulse of Rome through the voices of the people. the rustle of scrolls, the arguments in the forum below. And when he did speak, it was like a priest invoking not the gods, but the future. The sacred fire burned day and night in our house. We fed it in silence. We watched it flicker in the night winds. And sometimes, when he passed beneath the arches of the Regia, I imagined he too was a flame, not born of divinity, but destined to burn through everything that stood in his path. Pontifex Maximus, the highest priest, the keeper of Rome's soul, and yet, even as he wore the white veil and spoke the sacred rites, I think he knew something no one else yet dared to say out loud, that the gods of the Republic were growing quiet, and that soon the voice rising in their place would be his. The Republic was cracking, and every clever man knew it. The Senate, once the spine of Rome, had become a cage of egos. Old families snarled over old wounds. Laws were passed like favors, and every tribune who shouted reform was either bought, silenced, or buried. It was a game of power now, not honor, and Gaius Julius Caesar played it better than anyone. I watched from my garden, beneath vines that had outlived 3 generations of consuls. My son Brutus studied rhetoric in the courtyard. He was young, idealistic, full of belief in the republic his ancestors had died to preserve. I let him believe it. But I had seen more than he had. I had lain beside men who shaped the city with whispers, and I knew, long before the Senate did, that Caesar would never wait for permission again. He had returned from Spain with wealth, soldiers, and a name that no longer needed Marius to give it weight. And instead of storming the forum, he did something far more dangerous. He made allies. Crassus, who dripped coin like a leaking vault, whose fortune could drown any election. Pompey, Rome's golden general, adored by the army and feared by the aristocracy, and Caesar, the charming tactician, who brought them both to the same table and smiled as they signed what no one dared call an alliance. They called it the First Triumvirate, but there were no official titles, no laws passed to bless it, just 3 men wrapped in shadows, who divided Rome between them like a dish of figs. I asked him once, after he had left my bed and stood dressing by lamplight, what he intended to do with such power. He tied his sandals with calm precision and said, "What Rome refuses to give me, I will take. But I will let them believe they offered it." That was the genius, not the ambition. Any fool could want power. The genius was the restraint. He let Crassus play the financier, let Pompey win the games and feed the mobs. He kept himself soft-spoken, smiling, always reaching forward but never too far. The Senate didn't see it coming, or they did and simply chose to hope it might burn itself out. Caesar was elected consul not long after. His enemies tried to block him, tried to split the triumvirs apart, but he moved through their schemes like smoke through fingers. He married his daughter Julia to Pompey, tying his family to the general's pride. He passed land reforms, debt relief, grain laws, all dressed as gifts to the people, but each a foundation stone beneath his growing tower. And through it all, he wrote letters, hosted dinners, whispered into the right ears. He knew that power wasn't in the sword, it was in the story. If Rome believed he was saving them, they would never notice he was remaking them. Brutus watched from the edges of these circles. He admired Caesar, even loved him in his way. As many did, I kept my son at a distance. He still believed in Senate votes, in noble blood, in the old virtues. I didn't have the heart to tell him they were already buried, beneath roads and marble and Caesar's shadow. The triumvirate held, for now, but it was never meant to last. 3 men like that could not share anything for long, not gold, not glory, not Rome. Still, while it held, the Republic became an illusion. The people still voted. The Senate still argued. But the true decisions were made behind locked doors, beneath painted ceilings, with 3 names whispered like gods: Crassus, Pompey, Caesar. And of those 3, I only ever feared one. The year he wore the consul's robe, the whole house changed. The air thickened, the footsteps quickened, even the walls seemed to listen. I had served in Caesar's household for 5 years by then, polishing the mosaic floors, pouring wine for senators who never looked at me. But that year, everything sharpened. The laughter was quieter, the meetings longer, and every evening, as the lamps were lit and Rome's rooftops began to glow, he would walk alone in the atrium, hands behind his back, as if feeling the weight of something invisible and unstoppable. They said it was his year to play nicely, his year to appease the Senate, show gratitude to the Republic, honor tradition. But he had no patience for performance that didn't serve a purpose. He shared the consulship with Bibulus, a bitter little man who thought obstruction was strength. On the very first day, Caesar introduced land reform. Bibulus tried to block it. He called for omens, for delays, for the gods to intervene. Caesar didn't flinch. He simply stepped past him. When Bibulus locked himself in his house and claimed every Senate meeting was cursed, Caesar smiled and ruled without him. The people adored it. The senators grumbled. But Caesar kept moving. He passed laws with ruthless elegance, land for veterans, grain relief for the poor, and rewards for loyal allies. His enemies shouted of tyranny. He replied with banquets, theater, and charm. I watched him host feasts where his enemies sat beside him, full of wine and confusion, wondering how he'd turned their resistance into applause. There were days when I would carry messages from his study to the forum gates, notes sealed with wax that smelled faintly of cedar and myrrh, orders for votes, requests for silence, lists of favors owed. No one ever refused them, not truly, because by then he had become something more than a politician. He was the rhythm of the city. He never shouted in anger, he rarely threatened, but the men around him moved like chess pieces, careful and deliberate. Crassus came often, always looking over his shoulder. Pompey less so, but when he did, the conversations lasted deep into the night. I heard only murmurs through the marble walls, names, provinces, debts, wives, Rome, divided in whispers. His own wife, Calpurnia, kept mostly to herself. She was kind and cautious, and very aware that she lived in the eye of a rising storm. But Caesar spoke gently to her, even when his mind was clearly far away. And when his daughter Julia, now married to Pompey, visited the house, his face softened like sunlight breaking through a storm cloud. He knew how to use affection, just as he used law. Everything was part of the same current. When the Senate threatened to revoke his laws, he turned to the people. When the people rioted, he spoke to them calmly and gave them something new to want. He always gave them something to want. At the end of his consulship, there should have been a quiet retreat, a slow return to the Senate floor. Instead, he secured a command over Gaul, 5 years, an army, a continent to tame. Some thought it a reward, others an exile. But those of us who had served him knew the truth. It was a beginning. The morning he left for Gaul, I watched him ride out from the villa gates, not in triumph, not in ceremony, but in silence. His cloak brushed the stone. His eyes never once looked back, because Rome, in his mind, was no longer a city. It was the world, and he meant to take it. Before he came, the rivers ran quiet, and the oak groves whispered only to the druids. We lived by the seasons, by the will of the sun and the sound of the cattle. My father traded salt and wool along the Rhone. My mother wove charms to keep sickness from our door. We knew of Rome, of course. Everyone did. Their merchants came with silver and spices. Their soldiers marched through other lands. But they had not touched us, not yet. And then Caesar came. He came like a storm behind a smile. His legions moved like shadows, fast and silent, the earth trembling under their sandals. At first, we thought they were just passing through, chasing the Helvetii, the wandering tribe they said was burning everything in its path. But Caesar didn't just follow. He stopped them, surrounded them, crushed them, and when it was done, he wrote of it like poetry, like justice, like Rome had extended a hand, not a blade. They say over 200,000 Helvetii marched through Gaul that spring. They say only a quarter returned. I watched them pass, ragged, silent, dragging what little remained of their lives, and behind them the Roman standards, golden and gleaming in the cold wind. He did not leave after that. He stayed, built roads, dug trenches, sent envoys. He said he came to protect, but his legions never slept. They built their camps with the precision of temples, timber, stone, watchtowers, cities of war rising overnight where forests once stood. Some of our chiefs welcomed him. Others whispered of resistance. My uncle spoke of Vercingetorix, a young warrior gathering tribes in the heartlands. But the tribes were divided. Some feared Rome, others hated it. Many were tired of fighting each other and blind to what was coming. Caesar moved through our lands with the certainty of a man who had already written the ending. He did not scream. He did not threaten. He simply acted. When a tribe refused a treaty, he burned their villages. When a leader lied to him, he captured their family. He did not gloat. He simply wrote it all down in his journals and sent them back to Rome, where the people read them by candlelight and cheered his victories like stories from a distant dream. I saw him once, just once. He came to our village under a sky full of ash, his cloak heavy with rain. His face was calm, unreadable, carved like the statues his people placed in their temples. He looked at us, children, women, old men, and nodded as if taking measure of a people already lost to him. Then he spoke, not loudly, not cruelly. "Rome brings peace," he said, "but only after obedience." Some believed him, some bent the knee. But I remember how the old men watched him leave, their eyes full of a silence that held more fury than words ever could. That winter, our fields lay empty, our warriors gone, our future rewritten on scrolls we could not read. And still he pressed north, because Caesar did not come to visit Gaul. He came to consume it. They told us the Nervi were farmers, quiet people, tribal and proud, yes, but disorganized, backward, untrained. We believed it, like fools. We marched north with the confidence of men who had conquered nations. We crossed rivers, felled trees, and built our marching camps with perfect lines, our standards gleaming in the morning fog. The legions joked, the officers boasted. Caesar rode ahead on his horse, calm and focused, his cloak brushing the grass like a wolf's tail through leaves. We were not afraid. Not yet. It happened near the Sabis River. We were unpacking when the forest exploded. No horns, no war cries, just silence breaking into chaos. They had hidden for days, maybe longer, among the trees, behind the hills, beneath the brush. Thousands of them. They came at us like shadows with teeth, not like Gauls, like something older, desperate, pure. The camp dissolved into screams. Shields clashed, tents burned, horses panicked. I saw a boy no older than 15 take down a Roman cavalryman with nothing but a short spear and madness in his eyes. We had no formation, no order. I thought we would break, thought it was over. But then he came. Caesar. Not on the ridge, not shouting from behind, but in the heart of it. No helmet, no armor on his face, just a sword drawn, and that terrible stillness in his eyes. He didn't rage. He didn't scream orders. He moved like iron cutting through fire. He rallied the men by sheer presence. Officers fell in beside him, bloodied and breathless. Standards rose where they had fallen. Shields locked, spears leveled. The counterattack surged like a tide turning red. Legionaries regained the line. Centurions dragged the wounded back by their armor. And Caesar, he fought, not like a general, like a soldier. That was what made the difference. They saw him bleed, and because he bled, they stood. By nightfall, the nervy were broken. Not beaten, broken. Their leaders dead. Their warriors scattered into the woods like ghosts. But it wasn't victory. Not really. We found the wounded lying among the roots, clutching family amulets, whispering names to a sky that didn't answer. Some of our men wept when they saw what was left of the enemy. So few, so young. I heard Caesar's voice that night, quiet in the command tent. They fought like Romans, he said. If all Gauls were like them, we might never have crossed the Alps. The next day, he ordered their dead buried with care. He sent medics to the enemy wounded. But the campaign didn't stop. Nothing stopped. That was Caesar's way. Not cruelty, not mercy, just movement. Forward, always forward. We left the forest with fewer men and heavier hearts. The nervy were gone. But their blood stayed in the soil, soaked into the roots of every tree. And when the wind moved through the leaves, it whispered of fury, of defiance, of what Rome had met in that quiet wood. And Caesar, in his calm and terrible brilliance, wrote it down and marched on. We had built many things for him by then, bridges that held against floods, towers that scraped the sky, camps that rose and vanished like breath. But nothing compared to Alesia. Nothing came close. The Gauls had gathered behind their last great hope, Vercingetorix, proud, defiant, born to lead. They chose the high fortress of Alesia, a hilltop ringed by rivers and cliffs, surrounded by forests thick with memory and fire. We reached it in late summer, and Caesar, instead of storming the heights, ordered something different. We would build a wall around a city, not just to trap the enemy, but to break their spirit. We built for weeks, 11 Roman legions hammering the land into obedience, ditches, ramparts, wooden palisades layered with spikes and stakes, 23 miles of fortifications, every line measured, every gate guarded. He walked the lines daily, studying angles, soil, wind direction. He spoke little, only pointed. Here a tower, there a trench. We followed, always. Then came word. Gaul was not done. Reinforcements were coming, thousands more. A second army to crush us from behind. We were about to be surrounded. So Caesar gave another order. Build a second wall, facing the other way. And so we did. A wall within a wall, a fortress encircling a city while being encircled by a nation. Traps were laid, spears buried upright, watchfires lit from dusk to dawn. We slept with blades at our sides and woke with dust in our mouths. Every day the noose tightened, for them and for us. The siege dragged on. Inside, the Gauls starved. Outside, their allies screamed against our rear defenses. There were days we were attacked from both sides at once, the thunder of war pressing in like jaws from heaven and hell. And yet, the lines held, because Caesar was there. I watched him stand atop the ramparts as the final assault came, Vercingetorix surging from within, the relief army charging from without. Chaos in every direction. Horns, fire, blood, screams. The walls trembled, and Caesar stood at the center, wrapped in his red cloak, eyes like polished iron. He rode along the lines, never shouting, just raising a hand where the line wavered, nodding once where it held. The men followed that nod like it was a command from Jupiter himself. The enemy broke. first in confusion, then in panic. The outer army scattered. The defenders fell back behind their walls. And at dawn, Vercingetorix rode down in silence, dismounted, removed his cloak, and laid his sword at Caesar's feet. It was not just a victory, it was the end of Gaul. Caesar didn't celebrate. There was no feasting, no parade, only the cold work of counting the dead, feeding the prisoners, burying the fallen. He moved through the aftermath like a man harvesting the silence left behind. We engineers dismantled the walls after that, burned the timber, buried the traps, but Alesia never left us. It lived in our hands, in our backs, in the scars where the ropes had rubbed our palms raw. And I, who had drawn lines in dirt and measured the fall of arrows, knew that Caesar had conquered not with sword or siege, but with will, unshakable, patient, endless. Where others saw walls, he saw history. And then he moved on, he was gone, and yet he was everywhere. While Caesar carved his name into the bones of Gaul, Rome pulsed with his shadow. The Forum echoed with his victories. The Senate murmured his name in fear and flattery. Letters arrived each month, copied and read aloud in villas and taverns alike. Accounts of battles, of rivers crossed and kings subdued. He was not present, but he was never absent. I watched from my atrium, where the ivy crept up marble and the air tasted of olives and dust. My son Brutus paced the columns, torn between admiration and unease. He had grown into a man while Caesar made himself myth, and the distance between them widened with every triumph Caesar sent back in ink. The Senate stirred uneasily. Men like Cato sharpened their speeches like blades. They called Caesar a tyrant in waiting, a general drunk on power, a man who would not know how to come home without his legions at his back. They weren't wrong, but they were late. Pompey changed too. Once an equal, he now spoke of Caesar with clipped words and careful eyes. Julia was dead, Caesar's daughter, Pompey's wife. The bridge between them burned with her body. And with Crassus dead in Parthia, the triumvirate collapsed like a chair with one leg cut short. Only Pompey remained in Rome, and he grew fat on fear. The Senate gave him new powers, special commands, troops to protect the Republic. It was a slow, deliberate insult, a message. Caesar must return as a private citizen, they said. No army, no title. Come home and be judged like any other man. But Caesar had never been any other man. I knew he would not come back in chains. He had built too much, risked too much, loved too much. Yes, even that. He loved Rome like a sculptor loves marble, not for what it was, but for what it could become under his hand. So the city waited, each season heavier than the last. Elections stalled. Laws froze, bread riots flared and faded, all while his name grew louder in its absence. I remember the day Brutus came to me, holding one of Caesar's letters. His fingers trembled. He writes as if he owns the world, he said, as if nothing stands between him and the future. I said nothing, because it was true. And the truth was that Rome had already changed. The Republic still lived. In rituals, in robes, in speeches. But its heartbeat had shifted, and Caesar, out beyond the Alps, heard that pulse more clearly than the men in the Curia ever would. Shadows lengthened across the city. We all felt it. The hush before a storm, the breath before a blade is drawn. Caesar would return, and when he did, he would not ask for permission. The sky was heavy with rain, and the river swelled beneath the wooden bridge. I remember the sound of it, the soft, rushing whisper of cold water rolling over stone, and the way our horses fidgeted in the dark, breath steaming in the winter air. We were quiet, not out of fear, but anticipation. Something sacred was about to happen, something final. Caesar stood at the edge of the Rubicon, his cloak soaked, his face unreadable. He had been silent for miles. The men behind him waited, veterans from Gaul, hardened and loyal, their swords wrapped in oiled cloth, their eyes turned toward Rome. A single step would end the Republic. A single order would begin a war. He looked at me then, as if to see if I understood. I didn't. Not really. I was young, full of law and tradition, trained to believe in senatorial decrees and sacred boundaries. The Rubicon was not just water. It was a line of law, a line of fate. No general was to cross it with an army. To do so was treason. To do so was to challenge Rome itself. And then, quietly, he said, "Alea iacta est." The die is cast. He crossed. We followed. The river swallowed our footsteps as the legions moved behind him, not with cheers, but with the grim silence of men who knew exactly what they were doing. The torches flickered. The banners moved like ghosts, and the Republic, that old, brittle thing, began to fracture. There was no battle that night, no resistance. The towns along the way opened their gates, some out of loyalty, some out of fear. The people lined the roads, not with stones, but with offerings, bread, flowers, cheers, because they did not see a traitor. They saw a savior, a man who had fed them when the Senate argued, a man who had bled in the north so Rome would not bleed at home, and Pompey fled. The great general, once Caesar's ally, now his rival, left the city with the Senate at his heels. No stand, no last words, just dust and fear trailing behind him as he vanished south. I remember entering Rome behind Caesar, not as conquerors, but as shadows. He rode at a calm pace, head held high. No fire, no pillaging. He ordered the temples guarded, the grain stores protected. He walked through the forum like a man coming home, not to a place, but to a destiny long delayed. But there was no joy in him, not then, only a terrible purpose. The quiet knowledge that what had begun could not be undone, that Rome would never again belong to the old names, the old men, the old games. The Rubicon flowed behind us, cold, constant, silent. And history, like that river, moved forward without mercy. I remember the sound more than anything, not shouts, not war, but footsteps, rushed, uneven, echoing across the marble courtyards as senators fled the city like mice before flame. They carried scrolls tucked beneath their cloaks and fear carved deep into their faces. These were the men who had ruled Rome for centuries, and now they couldn't gather their horses fast enough. We were baking that morning. My master and I had risen before dawn, stoking the ovens, kneading dough with ash still in our hair. But the streets were restless. Word passed from lips to hands to doorways. Caesar had crossed the Rubicon. He was marching south. Pompey had vanished. And now the Senate was leaving. Not all of them, only the ones who had most to lose. They left in litters and carriages, their household slaves trailing behind with bundles of gold and silver stuffed into wine sacks. I saw one of them trip in the mud, an old man with the rings of 3 generations on his fingers. No one stopped to help him. The city they claimed to love was behind them, and they were too busy running to look back. And yet, there was no fire, no soldiers, no sword drawn against the gates. Caesar had not arrived in force. He hadn't needed to. His name was enough. His footsteps on the northern road echoed louder than 1,000 trumpets. The people stayed. We watched. We whispered. We leaned from balconies and huddled at fountains, wondering what would come next. Some feared civil war. Others hoped for change. But most, like me, simply waited. Bread still had to be baked. Children still had to be fed. And Caesar, whatever else he was, had always spoken to us with food, not just promises. By noon, the curia was nearly empty. The platform where Cicero once thundered now stood bare. The rostra where law was born and buried had no speakers, and still no blood had been spilled. When Caesar entered, there were no parades, no banners. He walked through the city gates like a man returning from travel, calm, measured, watching. The forum was silent as he passed. Men bowed, women stared, and the senators, those who had not fled, stepped back into the shadows. That night, torches lit the Palatine Hill, not in celebration but in preparation. Caesar dined simply, they said, and met with no one. He had taken Rome not by conquest, but by absence. The city had been left to him like a coin dropped in haste, and the Republic, for all its pride and marble, had run like water from an open jug. They came like storms from different skies, Caesar from the west, steady and silent, Pompey from the east, grand and shining. We watched them gather in the valley, our fields swallowed by tents and firelight. I had never seen so many men in one place, never heard so many languages twisted together by fear and hunger. The gods had gone quiet, and war had taken their place. My family stayed in the hills above the plain. From there we could see everything, the shapes of legions, the movements of scouts, the long, cruel lines of preparation. We prayed that the fighting would pass us by. It did not. For weeks, the armies stared at one another. Pompey waited. He had the numbers, the horses, the senators behind him. He believed Caesar would break from starvation, that his army, tired and far from home, would wither under pressure. But Caesar didn't flinch. He built trenches, cut off water, waited. And then one night the moon rose red over the valley, blood-colored and swollen, as if Olympus itself had opened its eye. The next morning, they fought. We watched from the ridge as the two greatest armies Rome had ever sent against itself met, like waves crashing in opposite winds. Pompey's cavalry charged, sweeping wide and confident. But Caesar had seen it coming. He hid reserves behind his front line, sharp, fast men who struck like knives under cloaks. The horsemen shattered, and once they broke, the rest followed. From the hills, it looked like a river changing direction. Pompey's proud legions, those old lions of the east, began to stumble, then to retreat, then to run. The dust rose so high we couldn't see the bodies fall, only the sound reached us, metal and breath, and the kind of silence that only comes when hope is pulled from the chest like a root. Caesar stood calm at the center of the storm. No celebration, no shouting, just control. He moved his lines with precision, herded his enemies like cattle, cut where the resistance was softest. He didn't fight for glory. He fought to end doubt. Pompey fled before sunset, disguised, desperate. The man who had once ruled the seas now ran from his own shadow. They said he wept, that he didn't speak, that he barely breathed until he reached the coast. And Caesar, victorious, walked among the dead. He ordered the wounded treated, friend and foe alike. He spared the officers who surrendered. Even some senators were allowed to live. But the message had been sent. Rome had chosen, not with ballots, but with blood. And the Republic, as it had been, died in that field beneath the red moon. I still walk the plain sometimes. The grass has grown back. The stones are quiet again. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the shields clash, still feel the weight of that moment when a nation chose one man over all its traditions. And the man they chose did not raise a crown that day. He didn't need to. He had already worn it in their minds. He came to us in rags, not the man I had heard whispered in the marble halls of Alexandria, not the conqueror they once called Magnus, just a shadow of a Roman, cloaked in dust, his face drawn and sunburned, his hair tangled with the wind of too many retreats. Pompey the Great, once the lion of the Republic, now a fugitive seeking sanctuary on Egyptian soil. We received the message before sunrise, a Roman fleet offshore, a request for audience. He asked for aid, for alliance, for shelter. But Ptolemy was young and his court was ruled by fear. Caesar had just crushed Pompey at Pharsalus. The Republic was no longer a stage with two actors. It was Caesar's theater now, and our king's advisors knew it. So they plotted a gift, one that would arrive before Caesar, one they believed would please him. I was summoned to the royal barge that afternoon, the sun cruel and hot on the Nile. I prepared the wine, laid out silks, waited by the rail as they rowed toward the ship carrying the Roman. I saw him step onto the smaller boat, tall still but slower, the weight of exile pressed into every joint. His wife clutched his hand, tears already slipping down her cheeks. He kissed her fingers before turning away. The boat pulled alongside ours. He reached for the hand offered to him by a Roman tribune in Egyptian pay, and then, in silence, they stabbed him. One blow to the chest, one to the throat. No trial, no words, just the Nile wind and the gasp of a man who had once held the fate of Rome in his grip. I saw his body fall into the bottom of the boat, blood mixing with salt and sun. His wife screamed from the other deck. The sailors rowed away, not in shame, not in haste, but in careful, rehearsed strokes, like men who believed they had just done something wise. We embalmed his head and placed it in a jar, wrapped in fine linen, sealed with the mark of the house of Ptolemy. I was the one who delivered it to Caesar 3 days later, when his legions reached the Nile. He did not open it. He did not smile. He stared at the gift as if it were a curse. Then he turned away, and his voice, when it came, was ice. "They have murdered a Roman consul," he said, "a husband, a man of dignity, and they think I will thank them." He ordered a funeral, not a gesture, a rite. Pompey's ashes were placed in a golden urn. A pyre was built on the beach. Caesar himself lit the fire. I watched him from the shoreline. There was no triumph in his eyes, no vindication, only something like mourning or memory. A look that said he had not wanted this end, that whatever had burned between them, rivalry, resentment, betrayal, it had not deserved to end in a knife and a lie. Pompey had fallen, not in battle, but in exile, not by Caesar's hand, but in fear of it. And in that moment, I understood something I never saw written in marble or sung by poets, that Caesar, in victory, often felt most alone. When she arrived wrapped in linen and silence, we thought she was a ghost. A servant carried her through the palace gates, hidden in a rug or a sail. No one is certain. But I was there when it unrolled, and she stepped out as if the marble had summoned her. Not frightened, not breathless, just alive and entirely herself. Cleopatra, daughter of Egypt. Exile turned queen in waiting. She had returned to take back what was hers, and she had come not with an army but with an idea. Caesar was in the palace already, surrounded by scrolls and courtiers, the scent of the sea still clinging to his cloak. He had come to restore order, or so he claimed, but Rome's order in Egypt was a fragile thing, bought with bribes and stained with Pompey's blood. When he saw her, something shifted. I saw it in the way he stood, in the way he studied her, not as one studies a stranger, but as if trying to remember a dream from long ago. She bowed slightly, then spoke in perfect Latin. She offered him her loyalty, her counsel, her country. He accepted all three. The days that followed were quiet storms. Their alliance was more than political. It was a meeting of minds, of wills, of two people who had survived the death of worlds and still wished to build one. She was younger, yes, but never small beside him. She debated him in the library, argued law beside his generals, traced the line of the Nile with her fingers, and made it sound like prophecy. And in the evenings, they would walk the palace gardens, not in secrecy, not in shame, but in a kind of shared understanding. She wore her crown like a question. He answered it with silence. The court watched with curiosity and fear. Some saw scandal, others saw strategy. But I saw something else, a pairing born not of romance, but of recognition. She ruled with elegance sharpened into survival. He commanded with precision cloaked in charm. Together they made the marble shiver. Then the fires came. Alexandria rebelled, bribed by Ptolemy's courtiers, threatened by Caesar's presence, afraid of Cleopatra's return. The ships burned in the harbor. The library was lost. The streets turned to ash and screams. But Caesar did not run. He stood in the palace halls, sword drawn, cloak soaked in sea spray and soot. He held the city with fire in his breath and Roman steel at his back. And she stood with him, not hiding, not pleading, fighting in her own way, with gold, with words, with loyalty so sharp it sliced through treason. When the siege was broken and her brother drowned in the Nile, she emerged not as a survivor, but as a ruler, Queen of Egypt in truth and by Caesar's hand. Rome did not crown her. She crowned herself. They stayed together that winter, whispered strategies beneath carved ceilings, slept on sheets that smelled of cedar and salt. She bore him a son, Caesarion, a child woven from two worlds. He never named him heir, but he never denied him either. And when he left for Rome, she watched from the harbor, her eyes dry, her chin high. She had given him something no legion ever had, mystery. And he had left her with something no other man had managed to offer, possibility. The Nile flowed on, the city rebuilt, but the echoes of their union lingered in every hall, in every scroll, in every shadow cast by the moon over the water. He had come to Egypt to punish a death. He left having touched something timeless. When he returned to Rome, the air changed. Not with war drums or fear, but with something quieter. He entered not as a conqueror, but as inevitability. The forum, once full of chaos and oration, stilled. The people lined the streets not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to see him. They wanted to touch the hem of history as it walked by. They called him dictator now, not the old kind, not the emergency measure of 6 months with power bound in law. No, this was something else. Caesar had returned not to restore the Republic, but to rule what was left of it. I stood at the edge of the curia, holding scrolls, listening to the murmurs rise and fall like waves. Senators who once spat at his name now whispered it with care. Some still plotted, some still prayed for his fall. But most watched with the same cautious awe as the rest of us. He rode through the city in a chariot of gold, with his soldiers trailing behind like shadows cast by flame. The spoils of Gaul, of Egypt, of Africa, of Spain, poured into the streets like a flood. Coins stamped with his name, statues raised in his image, parades that lasted for days, elephants marched beside priests, prisoners knelt before the crowd, and in the center of it all, Caesar, calm, unsmiling, as if each cheer reminded him how easily it could all turn to silence. He passed beneath triumphal arches built while he still fought in foreign dust. The people wept. Women threw flowers. Men reached out as if to grasp some piece of eternity. And yet he never looked drunk on their praise, only alert, always alert. In the Senate, he wore the purple robe, sat in the ivory chair. Dictator for 10 years, they decreed, then for life. He accepted with the grace of a man who had been waiting for the world to catch up to his own certainty. And still, he worked. He reformed the calendar, carving time into order. He settled veterans with land, rebuilt temples, fed the poor. He He appointed magistrates, expanded citizenship, redrew the map of power with a scholar's hand and a soldier's will. The Republic lived on in name, but its breath came through Caesar. Not everyone loved him. Cato was dead by his own hand. Cicero returned, cautious and quiet. Brutus, now my master's peer in the Senate, watched with eyes that never stopped calculating. He loved Caesar, or wanted to, or used to, but each new decree from the Forum steps placed another brick between them, and still Caesar smiled. Still he worked. In his villa, they say he studied stars, drew maps of the known world and traced paths through the unknown. He planned campaigns in Parthia, in Dacia, not for plunder, for legacy. He had conquered Rome, yes, but he was not finished. He never was. The people called him Father, Savior, God. But those of us who carried his words, who watched him from the shadows of colonnades and chambers, saw something else. Not arrogance, not cruelty, just solitude. The solitude of a man who had climbed beyond the city's walls, beyond its laws, and now stood utterly alone. It was the Lupercalia, and the city pulsed with noise and heat. Drums beat through the alleys. Boys in wolfskins raced through the crowd, laughing and lashing ribbons across the backs of giggling girls. The smell of crushed flowers and goat's blood tangled with the scent of sweat and spilled wine. Rome, for a day, was wild. I had my basket on the marble steps near the rostra. Figs, sweet and split with ripeness, buzzing with bees. And from where I stood, I could see everything, see him, Caesar. He sat in his ivory chair, robed in purple, the laurels on his brow like a crown already. The people shouted his name, louder than the drums, louder than the priests. He didn't wave, he didn't smile. He only watched, as if the forum were a fire he alone could control. Then Antony stepped forward. He held something in his hands, gold and twisted, shaped like a diadem, a crown. Not a king's crown, not openly, but something close enough to make the marble tremble. He lifted it high, turned to Caesar, and offered it. The crowd gasped, a sound like wind through dry leaves. Some cheered, others froze. I clutched my basket, the figs forgotten, and Caesar refused. He raised his hand slowly and pushed it away, not with anger, not with shame, just a small, deliberate motion. A man declining a meal he had already tasted in his mind. Antony tried again. The crown rose. The crowd leaned forward. Caesar looked out over us, at the faces painted with devotion and suspicion, and refused it a second time. That's when the applause came. Louder now, relieved, grateful maybe. We had tested him, and he had passed. We could believe again, for a moment, that Rome still ruled itself. He stood and gestured to the temples, to the gods, as if to say, let them decide. And yet, in that moment, I think many of us knew he didn't want the crown, because he already had what kings envy. He had Rome. That night, the story raced through taverns and courtyards. The crown refused, twice. The man who could take anything had turned away from power dressed in gold. They said it proved his virtue, his restraint. But some were not comforted. The senators whispered in marble halls, "Why test the people unless you mean to try again? Why refuse a crown unless you know it is already yours?" They saw in his refusal not humility, but calculation. They had watched him too long to believe in modesty. Still, he walked the city with calm. Still he worked, passed laws, heard petitions, made plans for Parthia, but the refusal lingered like perfume on a dead woman's dress, sweet, haunting, unforgettable. I sold out of figs by nightfall, and as I walked home through the narrow streets, I looked up at the sky, and I wondered, If a man holds the world in his hands and chooses not to squeeze it, does that make him merciful or patient? The nights grew restless. He did not sleep as he once did. His eyes, always sharp, now lingered too long in the dark. I watched him from our bed, the fire low, his shoulders still and stiff beneath the linen. When I touched his hand, it was cold. He did not flinch. He only whispered names, cities, rivers, stars, ghosts. I told him to rest. He told me there was no time. There were signs, omens. A soothsayer had warned him to beware the Ides. Birds fell silent in the gardens. A lioness gave birth in the forum. I dreamed of blood running from the pillars of the house, thick and slow, and of him standing still in it, reaching for something just beyond his grasp. I begged him not to go to the Senate that morning. He kissed my temple, promised caution, and walked into the dawn like a man already fading from the world. He knew they plotted. Of course he did. A mind like his sees through robes and rhetoric. He read betrayal in every nod, every delay, every echo that lingered too long in marble halls. But he said nothing. He did nothing, as if to act would dignify the threat, as if history would shield him. Outside, the city moved as always, chariots in the streets, merchants shouting their wares, the smell of fish and firewood and iron. But within our walls, I felt something curling inward, like breath held too long. He dressed slowly that morning, not with ceremony, with finality. He looked not like a man going to rule, but like a statue about to be sculpted. I held his hand at the threshold, told him again to stay, told him again of the dreams. He smiled and said the Senate could not wait. I think in that moment he knew he would not return. But Caesar feared many things, delay most of all. To hesitate was to surrender. And so he stepped into the morning light, robes catching the wind, his shadow stretching long behind him. I watched him go, one step at a time, toward the Curia, toward the Ides. The morning was clear, with sunlight sharp as glass on the stone. I stood by the rear columns of the Curia, the temporary Senate hall built within the theater of Pompeii. The room was cool and smelled of parchment, dust, and oil from the lamps we'd lit before dawn. We had been told to prepare the space well, to polish every step and sweep every trace of ash from the floor. It was a day of importance. The dictator was to arrive in person. He entered as he always did, measured, unhurried, with that heavy silence wrapped around him like a second cloak. He greeted those nearest with a nod, not warmth. He moved to his seat, the golden chair at the front, placed beneath Pompey's statue. That detail never escaped anyone, the irony of it, the shadow it cast. They gathered around him like petals closing over a flame, men he had raised, men he had forgiven, Brutus among them, quiet, pale, carrying the weight of 1,000 unread thoughts. Cassius with eyes too bright. Trebonius had already drawn Antony away. That too had been planned. The first blow came from behind. Casca, clumsy, rushed. Caesar turned, caught his arm, and said, "Et tu, Brute," not as an accusation, but as a sigh. Then the others followed, blades flashing like lightning in a storm. Dozens, no order, no rhythm, just frenzy and breath and the wet sound of history unraveling. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He stood as long as he could, and when he fell, it was at the base of the statue of Pompey, blood pooling beneath him, staining the marble red. That blood would not come clean, no matter how we scrubbed it in the days after. They left as quickly as they came, robes stained, faces pale, some weeping, some shaking with triumph. They called themselves liberators, called it justice. But when they stepped into the street, the city was silent. The people did not cheer. The gods did not stir. There was only the sound of a Rome suddenly leaderless, suddenly older, suddenly cold. And within the Curia, beside the fallen man, I stood frozen. Because I had watched power take shape in flesh, I had seen it breathe and speak and build a world around itself, and now it lay still, and no one, not even those with the knives, seemed to understand what they had done. We gathered in the forum before dawn, pressed shoulder to shoulder beneath a sky that refused to brighten. Smoke drifted from cook fires, and children clung to their mothers' cloaks. No one laughed. No one sang. There was only the hum of murmurs, a low throb of grief and dread that filled the air like incense. We had come not because we were told to, but because we had to see him. One last time. They brought his body on a bier, draped in purple, laurel still on his brow. He did not look small. He did not look dead. He looked like he might rise and speak at any moment. And all of us, every butcher and beggar and bricklayer, would fall quiet to hear it. He had given us grain, given us games, but more than that, he had given us Rome as something to believe in again. And now they said he was gone. Antony stood over the body, voice clear, hands trembling. He spoke of Caesar not as a general or a god, but as a man who bled, a man who wept, a man who dreamed of what Rome could become. He held up Caesar's will, read it aloud, the money he had left to us, the gardens, the gifts. He had thought of us, even at the end, and when Antony lifted the blood-stained cloak, showed us where the knives had torn it, the crowd cracked. Some wept, some screamed, some ran for the homes of senators. I saw torches lit, saw flames rise on the Capitol line. The funeral had become a fire. They built the pyre in the forum, not in the field of Mars as tradition demanded. We didn't care. We fed it with broken chairs, robes, branches torn from the sacred groves. And when his body was laid upon it, the flames did not wait. They took him, fast and high, as if the gods had grown impatient. The heat drove us back, but no one left. We stood until the last ember fell, until the smoke lifted above the rooftops and disappeared into a sky that had forgotten how to weep. Rome burned that night, not its walls, but something older. The old trust, the old balance, the old illusion that power could be contained within law and ceremony. He had ruled without a crown, and yet they killed him for being a king. And now, without him, the world tilted, because love, when betrayed, does not die quietly. We called his name into the smoke, and something in us answered. They said it was a star, but it moved like no star I had ever seen. It appeared just after sunset, high above the field of Mars, bright and burning with a tail like fire trailing into the heavens. I was only a boy sent with a jug of water from my uncle's cart, but everyone stopped to stare. Soldiers, merchants, mothers with infants in their arms. We forgot our errands. We forgot the dust. We only looked up. They called it Caesar's comet. The priests said it was a sign that his soul had risen into the sky, accepted by the gods, placed among the stars like Aeneas, like Romulus. They called him Divus Julius, no longer just a man, but a god. The people believed it. They needed to. He had been more than a ruler. He had been the rhythm of the world. Without him, the city stumbled. Rome changed after his death. The senators tried to speak again, to pass laws, to pretend the republic still lived, but no one listened. Not truly. They looked to the young men now, Octavian, his heir, pale and deliberate, Antony, bold and burning with vengeance. The streets divided like veins under a blade. Alliances broke. Brothers turned on each other. The war he had tried to end with his life only deepened. But in those first weeks, before the next battles began, there was silence. A strange, wide silence. His statues were cleaned, his name whispered at crossroads. The forum seemed larger somehow, as if it missed the weight of his presence. And we, the people, walked slower, spoke softer, carried the stillness of morning in the spaces between words. I remember passing the temple of Venus Genetrix, where his image stood wrapped in marble. I placed a fig at the steps, not knowing why, just needing to leave something behind. And every night that the comet stayed in the sky, we watched it. My uncle said it would fade soon, that no star burned like that for long, but I kept hoping it would remain, just one night more. A light to mark the edge of the old world, a reminder of the man who had held Rome in his hands and tried to make it new. When the comet vanished, the sky seemed colder, but by then we had already changed, because though they had silenced the man, they could not silence the story. And in the quiet that followed, Caesar became more than memory. He became myth.